In 1894, deep within a remote stretch of the forest, there was a family that no map ever marked, no traveler ever spoke of openly, and no villager dared approach after nightfall. For 6 generations they lived in isolation, their lives woven tightly with the rhythm of the forest itself, so that each child born seemed to inherit more than just their parents' features. Each generation changed in ways that whispered of something older, something familiar yet distant, until by the 6th, the children walked and moved in a way that no one could place, their faces holding traces of something that once belonged to the wild. The villagers spoke of them only in murmurs, careful to glance at the edge of the trees, careful not to meet eyes that did not belong to anyone they had ever known. And though the forest around them seemed ordinary to those passing through, the family within had become something entirely removed from the life outside, a line of humans who had gradually shifted into forms that others could scarcely imagine, leaving behind a legacy that would be remembered, whispered, and feared for generations to come. Back then, the settlements were few and far between, connected only by narrow dirt paths that wound through thick groves and across rivers that swelled after every storm. Life was slow, measured by the rising and setting sun, by the rhythm of crops and the movements of animals in the surrounding forests. People kept to themselves, wary of the spaces they did not know, and even more wary of those they only spoke of in whispers. At the edge of this region, bordering a stretch of trees that seemed endless, lived the family that had drawn the attention and the fear of every villager in the area. They were rarely seen at the market, rarely heard on the roads, and when someone caught a glimpse of them, it was enough to stop conversations, halt footsteps, and leave a chill in the air. The children, quiet and watchful, seemed to change slightly with each passing year, and the elders would shake their heads and mutter to one another, speaking of things that should not be spoken aloud. It was a place where the ordinary world ended, and something else, older and stranger, began. Imagine for a moment that you lived in those settlements, that you walked the narrow paths between fields, listening to the calls of birds and the rustle of leaves in the distance. Now imagine seeing, at the very edge of the forest, figures that move differently, quiet, deliberate, watching from the shadows, and knowing that no one else dares approach them. Would you let your children play near that place? Would you speak to them if they came to your door? Or would you step back and pretend you had seen nothing at all? Some villagers chose the first path, drawn by curiosity, and they never returned the same. Others avoided the edge entirely, leaving the forest and its secrets undisturbed, though always aware, always listening. And you, watching this now, what would you have done if you had been there, hearing the whispers of generations that no one outside those trees could truly understand? The story of this family did not begin with the 6th generation, of course. It had taken shape over decades, each child born quietly carrying hints of the forest within them. The first generation had been ordinary enough, though the villagers noted their preference for solitude, their unusual attentiveness to the sounds of the trees, the way they would watch animals with a gaze that seemed to measure understanding beyond what people expected. By the 2nd generation, subtle changes began to appear. Children moved with an agility that startled the adults around them, their limbs bending and stretching in ways that were just a little too supple, their eyes catching light differently, glinting in the shadows. Still, many dismissed it as mere exaggeration, stories told to frighten the curious. By the 3rd generation, however, whispers grew louder. Those who glimpsed the children from afar said their walk was neither human nor animal, a strange rhythm that unnerved even those who thought themselves brave. The fourth generation took it further. Limbs that seemed too long, faces that carried unusual proportions, and a restlessness that made them vanish into the trees with ease. At night, some villagers swore they could hear strange chattering, a sound that mixed something familiar with something entirely foreign, echoing faintly through the forest. By the fifth generation, the fear became palpable in the small community. The children were rarely seen in the open, and when they were, the villagers noticed features that suggested a life spent half in the trees, half in the shadow of human form. Fingers curved slightly, feet that barely touched the ground, movements that were swift, deliberate, and unsettling. Even the bravest hunters avoided the forest's edge after dusk, for they had glimpsed shapes moving among the branches that could not be explained. And then came the sixth generation. By this time, the family had become something entirely apart from the world around them. Villagers no longer called them human at all. The children walked differently, sounded differently, and those who dared glimpse their faces could not unsee what they had seen. There were stories of eyes reflecting the moonlight in ways that seemed impossible, limbs extending beyond natural proportion, and movements that suggested both calculation and instinct, human and something else, intertwined. It was a lineage that had changed so gradually, so deliberately with time, that the forest itself seemed to recognize their difference, bending around them, holding them within its oldest shadows, as if marking a place where human history no longer applied. The event that would be remembered above all others occurred one night when the moon hung low and heavy over the treetops. A young villager returning from a distant farm passed near the family's clearing. He had been warned repeatedly to keep his distance, but curiosity tugged at him as he noticed movement just beyond the edge of the forest. At first, it seemed to be children playing, but the shapes were wrong. Too quick, too silent, too deliberate. He watched, frozen in the shadows, as one of the figures leapt from branch to branch with a grace no human could possess. Then the others emerged, moving with the same unnatural precision. Their faces were partially obscured by the darkness, yet the glimpses he caught were enough to unsettle him for the rest of his life. Elongated features, eyes that seemed to catch every flicker of light, bodies that bent and twisted as if in rhythm with some unseen pattern. They were aware of him. They turned in unison, and in that moment, he felt a recognition in their gaze that chilled him to the core. He fled before they could approach, yet the forest seemed to follow him, carrying the faint echo of chattering voices that were neither wholly human nor wholly animal. When he returned to the settlement, he could barely speak of what he had seen, and those who tried to imagine it were filled with a deep unease. Even the elders, who had grown accustomed to the family's strangeness, spoke in hushed tones, describing the night as a moment when the boundary between human and something else had been made unmistakably clear. From that night onward, the family's presence was no longer a quiet whisper in the village. It was a shadow that all who lived nearby carried with them, a reminder that something entirely other walked just beyond the familiar paths. By the time the sixth generation had fully come of age, the family had vanished almost entirely from sight. The children of that final generation were said to move with a silence that no human could maintain, climbing trees, swinging between branches, and disappearing into the shadows of the forest with a speed and ease that left villagers shaken. The midwife, who had been present at the birth of the last child, refused to speak of it for the remainder of her life. She would only mutter that she had never seen anything that belonged wholly to this world. Others who glimpsed the family at dusk told similar stories. A child, perched high in a tree, looking down with eyes that seemed both knowing and unbound. A presence that was human in shape, yet alien in movement and expression. Some villagers swore that on certain nights, when the wind carried the right sound through the treetops, they could hear the echo of laughter or cries that were too sharp, too fast, too deliberate to belong to ordinary children. The forest itself seemed to embrace the family's disappearance, hiding them in the deepest shadows, leaving behind only the memory of what had once been human and what had become something entirely other. And so the family, over 6 generations, completed the transformation. By the final child, the line that had begun in ordinary flesh had stretched beyond the bounds of human form, leaving behind a legacy of movement, sound, and presence that no villager could fully comprehend. It was a living reminder that life, over time and in isolation, could bend in ways that challenged the understanding of those who dwelled just beyond its edge. Life around the forest's edge continued with its ordinary rhythms, yet anyone who lived nearby could not help but notice the odd patterns that belonged to the family within. Their days were measured not by the sun alone, but by the sounds of the forest itself. Children were seen slipping into the shadows before sunrise, returning only at dusk, their hair disheveled, eyes bright with a knowledge the villagers could not place. They seemed to respond to the slightest rustle of leaves, the faintest movement of animals, as though the forest itself guided their actions. Neighbors whispered of strange gatherings near the old clearing, of fleeting glimpses of limbs moving unnaturally, and of chattering sounds that carried long into the night. Even the trees around their home seemed altered, branches broken in patterns too precise for wind, footprints pressed into the soil in directions no ordinary child would take. Sightings became more frequent as the generations passed. Hunters reported seeing shadows darting through the treetops, a strange mixture of human form and animal agility. Those who dared follow would find only fleeting impressions, a flash of movement, the glint of eyes, the sound of laughter that carried a sharpness no child could produce. Villagers avoided these paths entirely after sunset, and even those who worked in the forest during the day felt a persistent unease, as if being observed. Footprints appeared that were neither wholly human nor animal, leading deep into the trees and vanishing without a trace. Each encounter strengthened the stories that had long been whispered, that the family was something separate, something the world had never seen before, and perhaps something that was no longer meant to be seen at all. Elders spoke only in murmurs, recounting fragments of stories passed down through decades. They warned children never to wander near the forest edge, telling tales of beings who could move unseen, who could hear every sound, and who carried the memory of 6 generations. Some said that the family could mimic voices, luring the curious into the depths of the woods. Others claimed that even when the family was absent, the forest itself held a presence, bending shadows in ways that suggested they were never truly gone. These warnings were repeated with solemnity, a mixture of fear and respect, for those who ignored them rarely returned with coherent words to explain what they had seen. Travelers reported glimpses of children moving through trees, climbing with unnatural precision, leaping distances no human could achieve. Their movements were deliberate, yet fluid, blending seamlessly with the branches and undergrowth. The sounds they produced, a mixture of laughter, chattering, and low calls, were unsettling, carrying through the forest in ways that seemed almost sentient. Occasionally, hunters would glimpse multiple figures simultaneously, moving in synchrony, disappearing before they could be approached. It was as though the family had learned to inhabit the forest as a single organism, indistinguishable from the shadows and the wind, yet always present, always watching. There were nights when screams echoed faintly across the settlements, stories of travelers vanishing near the edge, of small animals found in patterns too deliberate to be random. Children reported seeing figures crouched in the trees, following them silently, yet never touching them. Carcasses of deer and other forest creatures were found positioned unnaturally, hinting at an intelligence beyond mere survival. Villagers began leaving the area, fearful of the family and the presence that seemed to linger even in their absence. The land itself, over decades, took on a reputation, as though it carried the imprint of 6 generations of beings who had walked its paths in a form no human could match. As the forest reclaimed parts of their old clearing, stories persisted. Parents told their children of the family's origins, describing the gradual changes, limbs that grew longer with each generation, faces that shifted, eyes that reflected not just light, but the depths of the forest itself. The 6th generation, they said, moved as if the boundary between human and something else had dissolved entirely. The villagers spoke of them as a memory, a warning, and a legend. Even decades later, those who wandered too close felt a presence, fleeting glimpses of movement that defied explanation. It was a lineage that had begun like any other, but had grown in ways that the ordinary world could never contain. And so, the family vanished from sight, leaving behind only the forest and the memory of what had once been human. Even now, the older villagers say that the trees hold echoes of their presence, that on quiet nights you can hear the faintest chattering, a sound that is almost human, yet not quite. Some claim to see shadows flitting between the branches, moving with a grace and purpose that no ordinary child could possess. The legacy of 6 generations lingers still, a reminder that life, left untouched and unbound by the world outside, can take forms we cannot imagine, and can leave marks that time will never erase. If you wish to hear another story like this, whispered across generations and hidden in the oldest forests, join me in the comments. Tell me which part of this tale unsettled you most. For there are other families, other forests, and other secrets that have been waiting for those who dare to listen.